Department of Media, Cognition and Communication at the University of Copenhagen. Maja has had a long-term interest in STS, science communication, public understanding of science, research organizations and management, as well as higher education. She's currently working on issues of public understanding of synthetic biology, social scientific responsibility, and communication by research leaders. She also holds a number of important positions as member of the Danish Council for Research and Innovation Policy, and she's also an elected member of the East Council. Today, she'll be talking about breaking, or her title is entitled Breaking and Entering, Engaging Publics in the Discussion of Scientific Social Responsibility. So welcome, Maja, and thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Aro. And I want to just start by thanking Anna for the invitation to come here and speak to you. I'm very, very honored to be here, and I am so happy to be able to talk about some of the research that I do, because as head of department, that's kind of a side activity that I have. So it's very nice to remember why it was I started out doing all these things. What I will be doing today is I will talk a little bit about some research that I've done on the social responsibility of science, particularly how scientists think about that. But I will talk mostly about how I, with a lot of other people, turned this into an interactive installation that was engaging publics in discussion about the outcome of our research. Now, we talked yesterday a little bit, Thomas mentioned speculative design practices, and I guess that's, I have actually at some point been contributing to that kind of thinking as well, working with Mike Michael, but I won't actually be talking about those kinds of thoughts. Actually, this is a very atheoretical presentation, but I'll be happy to talk about this. It just got me thinking that originally, because I'll be talking about this installation, it's actually the third of those kinds of installations that I've been doing. I work very closely with a designer to do them. And originally, we got the idea because I'd seen the call for Peter Weibel and Bruno Latour's making things public, and I was like, right, I want to be part of that exhibition. I never really got round to doing anything that could go into the exhibition, but it is true that some of this stuff actually really grew out of that kind of thinking and how that's been. So, but let's just see, I just want to say, if you want to discuss more the sort of theoretical background behind it, I'll be very happy to do so after the talk. But I find that I need to spend quite a lot of time actually sort of just demonstrating or explaining how this works. So that's what I'll be doing in the talk. So first of all, as I said, this is an installation that's about some of the research. So I'll just be saying a little bit about what that research was. It was a project called Scientific Social Responsibility, and it was called that because I thought it out when I was still employed by Copenhagen Business School, and I thought I had to do something that was kind of relevant to business researchers. So I thought, okay, if I call it this, then it'll, be very close to corporate social responsibility, and then we can talk about the differences between science and business and stuff like that. Then I moved, but it's still a title that served the project well. The idea was to look at different levels in science and to see how particularly we were interested in, you can see the three levels there, the policy institutions at the macro level, the management of research organizations at the meso level, and then the bench scientists at the micro level. Of course, like we discussed yesterday, I don't really believe in this distinction between macro and micro, but that figure there is a good example of what you have to do in order to get funding to do things. You have to sort of specify. And that's how we did. So there was two sub-projects. One was looking at the relationship between policy discourse and what goes on in the organizations, particularly at the management level. That was sub-project A. And the second one looked at particularly at the relationships between the managers of research organizations and then the bench scientists. And what we found, just to sort of put that up front, is that there is not a lot of connection. There's a lot of scientists who haven't even heard about all this policy discourse about social responsibility or responsible research and innovation or whatever we want to call it. And that doesn't mean that they don't have a lot of thinking about their responsibilities. They have a lot of stuff there. And actually the outcome of the entire project is that we would like to say that policymakers and managers need to think about how they can connect these ideas about responsibility to the things that scientists experience in practice, because otherwise it's never going to be anything else but some, you know, add-ons that's found more or less relevant for the science, for the practice of science. But I won't say more about that. I'll just say one of the things we did in that project was that Cecilia, who's a PhD student at the time, now she's a postdoc, and I worked on this, made this paper where what we did there was actually a discourse analysis of lots of academic journal articles. So we had, originally we collected 1,000 about that sort of journal articles using Scopus and other methods from the entire sort of body of journals on science. And then we narrowed it down, so I think we ended up with 263 that we then analyzed much more in depth. And what we found was that in these journal articles, there was at least 4 different ways of configuring the responsibility of science. And we put them up here nicely like discourses. We did this using Foucauldian discourse analysis. And I'm always quite wary about saying how, you know, that they're totally separate. Of course they aren't. Lots of journal papers were sort of using more than one of these. But we saw these discursive formations crystallize into these 4 different ways. And the interesting thing, of course, is that at least some of them are mutually exclusive. So if we start at the bottom, the demarcation is the one that says that science science should be separated from the rest of the world in order to be responsible, so it isn't sort of influenced by undue bias. Quite classical understanding of the responsibility of science. Then if we move up, the reflexivity is the one that still holds that science has to be in control of science, but it does have to look out and see what's going on in society and try to help solve problems there. If we move over to the right, the contribution and actually also the integration, that's the 2 formations that says that you can't just leave science in control of science. The external surroundings or society, or whatever you want to call it, has to take part in this and has to be part of controlling what's going on in science. That's why those are over there with the external regulation and the other 2 are with the internal regulation. The contribution is the one that says that, well, taxpayers pay for science, so taxpayers should have the benefits of science. So we deliver some money to science and a wish list for things we would like science to fix, and then we come back and collect the results after a while. And then finally, the integration is the one that says, well, it's only if scientists work with other people in society that actually it can be responsible and do proper good solutions for society. And that's the distinction between the top ones and the bottom ones. The top ones are focused on the outcome of research, whereas the bottom ones are focused on the process of doing science when they're thinking about regulation. So that's a really neat paper. I'm happy with it. You know, it was published, and that was it. Then at the same time, there was a call for projects on communicating science, in particularly in relationship with the ESOF 2014, the Euroscience Open Forum conference that was held in Copenhagen in 2014. And there was this pot of money, and it was quite clear that if you wanted to, if you as a scientist of University of Copenhagen and other places wanted to be a good scientist, you know, chip into this big conference where the whole Europe is coming to Copenhagen. And as I had this thing, I'd been doing these installations before, I was kind of like, well, there isn't really any way I can not do this. So, you know, we'll have to think about doing something for this conference. And of course, we'd just done this paper. And one of the things I'd been doing was when I was explaining, like I did before to you, I used the metaphor of an ivory tower. So I said the demarcation is just an ivory tower, you know, closed. The reflexivity, that's when you put a window into the ivory tower so scientists can look out and see what's going on. The contribution, that's when you have a door at the bottom of the ivory tower, and there, you know, there's a little hatch where you can leave your wish list together with the money you roll in wheelbarrows. And then finally the integration, that's when the door is wide open and everyone runs in and out of the tower. And I'd been using that, so I thought, okay, can we actually, you know, can we possibly do an installation that sort of does this and invites people into a discussion about what is the responsibility of science. And the ivory tower that you see is actually that construction there in the middle. But I'm just going to go over here and put on a video that will give you a little bit more of a flavor of this. Now we hope it works. Oh, we need the sound. It's not coming out of the thing.
Social responsibility of science. Each entrance represents one ideal. Welcome to a digital tour of the installation, Breaking and Entering, explore how science and society relate. There's no right or wrong way to meet the installation. The most important thing is curiosity and a desire to have your opinions challenged. The White Tower in the middle of the installation presents 4 different perspectives on the ideal relationship between science and society. These ideals contain very diverse understandings of the social responsibility of science. Each entrance represents one ideal, and hence a certain understanding of the role of science in society. At the counter, you can pick up an iPad and use it to find a number of images throughout the installation and scan them. When you scan an image, a video starts and elaborates on the subject that the image represents. In Entrance 1, you can build on to the scientific structure and maybe contribute to the development of true knowledge. Here, science is separated from society, and the scientists decide themselves which areas need attention. In Entrance 2, you, as a scientist, have to look out into society and be aware of its problems and challenges. Science has to focus on research that works to solve these problems. In Entrance 3, you as a citizen can say which societal problems you believe should be solved. Then it's the job of politicians and society to choose the most important problems that science should work to solve. In Entrance 4, a close collaboration and open dialogue between scientists and citizens ensures that the most important problems of society are solved. Around the White Tower are several stations where you can let your opinion be heard. Among other things, you can write down your hopes and fears for the future, consider the degree of risk that science can cause, or cast a vote on who should prioritize funds for scientific research. All the examples used in the installation are based in the new field synthetic biology and the solutions and problems that this field poses. There are no easy answers or quick solutions, but by exploring the relationship between science and society, we're already off to a good start. If you want more information, please go to www.breaking/entering.dk.
So as you see, the idea was that we turned each of those 4 ideals into a scientist and then gave them sort of the different. And you notice that it's the same guy who does these 4 scientists thing. We actually had lots of discussions about this because we were originally we wanted the the real scientists that we work with in synthetic biology to sort of to be filmed and to be there, but that was just way too complicated. And then we had lots of discussions about whether we should have men and or female, men or women, and should they be white or other colors. And in the end, we just ended up taking. There was one guy on our team who'd also trained as an actor, so in the end we ended just opting for him. But actually, it's interesting, later on that then, of course, we have a white male scientist, which is, just what you end up doing like that. But the idea is that sort of you see those four ideals, and then at the entrance, there was this image, and then we had this little video where he was saying things, and I can't actually read it from here. I think you could probably sort of get the sense if you just read the first lines, if you can. But this was the guy in the second intro. So that's a reflexivity ideal. So he was very much about, there's lots of things we need to do, and I need to think about all the problems and fixing them. In the first entrance, the demarcation, because there was on the video this thing saying that so that was one of the things that we said there has to be a puzzle or some kind of jigsaw thing in each of the entrances, and so we had a lot of thinking about how these were. This is the one in the first entrance, and as she said on the video, this is kind of the idea is that you could actually with these sticks and you could build quite elaborate structures, or you could make something that was quite beautiful if you wanted to, for its own sake. So that was the idea, that we let people do something with their hands that has some kind of connection to that idea of what science is. And then also, when you'd done that, you could scan with the iPad. You could scan it. You'd hear this video.
Maybe your contribution to the structure is the missing link. Science develops as scientists elaborate on each other's work. Every time someone shares a small piece of knowledge through publication, the whole becomes larger and more nuanced. Scientists are often driven by curiosity to understand everything we don't yet know about the world. Everyone hopes that their contribution is central, but it can take a long time before the meaning of each piece becomes clear.
Okay, so let's move on. This is from the third ideal, which is exactly that thing where you could write your own problems that you want solutions to, right on the outside, then you post them through those tubes, and then on the inside you could take them out, and there was another place where you could sort of hang them, and according to how important you thought they were, so it was kind of like a structure with a bullseye in the middle and then further out. So if you found a problem you thought was really important, you put it in the bullseye. And on the next one, I've just listed the first. I'm going to say this before I get there because I want to read out when we get there together, because otherwise, I've listed the first 15 problems that we found that was in English. So there's no selection of. So this is everything that comes in, and there's a point to what I'm saying here. So I wish that we were able to travel to other stars, climate change, research on why people have knowledge, for instance, about their health or climate change, but don't act on their knowledge, too much inconsiderateness about the environment. I'd like to see an end to socialism. I would like to find out how we build the hospitals of the future so they match the future challenges. I want a fucking unicorn. The Riemann conjecture. World will survive. There won't be any illnesses. I still love her. Cancer, and so on. And the reason why I'm doing this is because it's something I've been writing about concerning the other installations. Because it's always like this. When you ask people to feed in, they will say different types of things. And for instance, I want a unicorn. That's a very, very interesting thing, because is that fun? because remember well, I didn't say that very clearly, but we use synthetic biology as the case example in the installation. So it could well be a comment on the fact that we were talking about synthetic biology. It could also just be there was lots of school kids, well, sort of school youth in this installation. So it could also just be, that's what I would like. Certainly the I still love her doesn't really necessarily have any relationship to the theme at hand, but it also demonstrates how people mix in with what's going on in their life. And actually, if you think about it, the fact that I still love her might be much more important than anything to do with science policy or anything else. And who am I to say that this girl or man, should not think about this all the time? It's just, and that's actually for me a really, really important point, that we have to open up, because I've had this discussion a lot of times also with the previous installations, that people get a bit, impatient with the fact that people put in all this irrelevant or nonsense stuff. But I actually think that's exactly the point. The point is that we have to make spaces where we can think of science as part of a life, and therefore also integrate all these other things in it. And I didn't have to we did actually at some point take out a few, not here, but there was another place where people could also leave little notes. And there was a few obscenities there. And we do take them out. Because the thing is that the experience is that might take, as soon as that's there, then other people will sort of go away. So it's but it's a very fine balance, this, when do you censor, how do you censor, what you censor. It also proves that even if you have a point that you want to be as open as possible and leave everyone to say exactly what they want, you can't avoid censoring. Well, actually, it isn't so open, right? This whole thing is very, very configured. People come in and they're supposed to do particular things. It's not just, this isn't a very open thing if you look at it like that. It's open in one way and closed in other ways. So this is the fourth entrance. And what you see there, you could also see it on the video, is there are these big puzzle pieces, jigsaw pieces, and there's 6 of them. And the idea, they are hanging in elastic bands, quite far from each other. So the idea is you have to have 6 hands in order to hold them together, because otherwise, so you have to, and there's only space for top 2 people inside that part of the tower. So you have to work with someone who stands outside and lends you their hands to hold it together.
In modern societies, problems and their solutions are so complex that scientists have to work with many other groups. Only by involving all affected parties can you make sure that science deals with the most important issues, and that the solutions created are in line with the values and needs of a society. Many different people and groups can contribute, and it's important that every contribution is respected.
Yeah, so of course the idea was you do the puzzle and then you hear this film. And just to make things fun, actually you can see it's me there behind the column. But the other 2 guys I'm standing with, that's the Vice Chancellor and the Pro-Vice Chancellor of University of Copenhagen. And I have another talk, or at least one, that's about science communication as organizational communication. And I always use pictures from this particular instance because it just raises all these other issues of how, when I was standing there, of course I wanted those 2 guys to understand, the actual communication. That this ideal symbolizes this view on science. But of course I also wanted those guys to come in there and say, oh wow, that's a great job, they know what they're doing, good organizational member, she's very good, blah, 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 all of that. And I just say that because I think that's another really important point in terms of public engagement. Why is it that scientists do this? We often tend to think that sort of there's motivations, but I think that it's impossible to say that these things aren't also branding. And I don't think that that means that it's bad. It's just something that we have to take into account, that there's always several motivations and possibly even in slight conflict with each other when we do this. So then so that was the last of these 4 entrances that I've now gone through, the 4 different ideas. What we then also done was we put some sort of what we called stations outside with other kinds of questions, which were in some ways easier to get at. So lots of people who go to science shows like that don't necessarily want to engage with the whole thing and have an iPad and stuff. They just want to browse a little bit and then be able to escape fast. So these stations were quite good at that because people could sort of go without, involving themselves too much. So one of them here is, who decides? Society gives certain resources to science. Who do you think should prioritize funds? And then there's these 6 different voices. And then there's next to them, you can see there's these little brown pads where you can actually put a voting stick in. So you can see, it's a bit unclear, but you can see that there's lots of votes up there in the top one. And let's just see. Of course, this would be better if I didn't have to run around them. So that's the politician.
We need to prioritize research that can create growth and new jobs for this country. We have to be at the forefront of the knowledge society. That is why we need to focus on innovation and technology. For too long, scientists have sat in their ivory towers. It is time for them to come out and take an interest in how science can become relevant for society.
And of course, the idea was that you could click on all the other ones, and that would kind of, then their heads would come out and talk to you and say different things. Oh, God, I'm negotiating here. So, another one, and that's the last one with the last video, and then I won't jump backwards and forwards anymore, I promise. Another one was about risk, and that was actually something that came out of lots of discussions with the synthetic biologists, because we've been discussing this issue of whether people can understand risk or not, and whether people want risk, normal publics can sort of enter into a meaningful discussion about risk. And when I made this, and I told the made this part of the installation, told the synthetic biologists about it, they were like, can't you just not talk about that? Does that have to be there? But actually, I think this is one of the stations that we really had good feedback on. So some people got very provoked by it, and other people, thought it was really interesting and it made things clear to them. So I think that, of course, and I'm trying to get the synthetic biologists to get this idea that instead of shying away, we should do a lot more of this. So the idea is that you're asked, risk, what's a treatment worth? And then it says there, imagine this is real. Scientists have found a cure that will save at least 1 million people worldwide. But there might be some side effects. How many people do you think, so some people might be dangerously ill instead of becoming better. So how many people do you think is worth putting at risk to save 1 million? And then you can choose, so you can sort of say 0, or then you can, there were some elastic bands you could put around the number of people. I mean, there's these images of people, so you could put these elastic bands around the number of people that you think it's fair to put at risk in order to do this. And we didn't say anywhere that no one would ever be, that we don't even enter into this. And the interesting thing, of course, is that a lot of people put the band around quite a lot of people. So to say that publics can't accept risk is just totally wrong. It's a question of how you put it. But once they put the elastic band around, they got the explanation, and that's the last one I will show you. Or the explanation, but a explanation.
Modern societies have created large and elaborate systems for the approval of new medicines. This has been done because we don't want to risk the marketing of new medicines that will make people ill. But it has a price. Because the approval process is so elaborate, it's very expensive to develop new medicines. That's why many medical companies focus on illnesses that affect a lot of wealthy people. It's here that the ability to pay is highest. However, this system makes it more difficult to raise money for the development and approval of medicine for rare illnesses, and for illnesses that affect the poorer parts of the world.
Yeah. And just the last thing I want to show you is how then another point is that this installation, of course, changes the way it looks as people interact with it. For instance, there, the elastic band goes out, it goes in, it disappears, it comes back again, things like that. So each person leaves traces for the next one to sort of see, which is also, that's been in all the installations we've made. This is kind of mirroring the idea of public debate as a sort of running stream of comments. Each comment is kind of leaving a landscape for someone else to engage in. But this was another one where the question is who has responsibility for the responsible use of science, and then we had these 4 groups that people could vote for, and actually we've had a similar kind of question in the other installations, and it's quite interesting how to see how the answers sort of are distributed, not exactly in the same way in those 3 installations that we have. Politicians always get a lot of votes. Usually researchers, due to industry, usually gets very little votes. But that wasn't the case here, I can say. Citizens usually get quite a lot of votes as well. But let's see. So this is the first day, obviously. No, almost none. The next day, yeah, I can't remember whether it was. But, you know, I have 3 images that are sort of progressing. So there you see that they've begun to come in, politicians and scientists. And then this is just before we closed. And still politicians up on the left and scientists down there. And then industry, strangely, has quite a lot of votes here, which might have to do with the fact that this was in a different setting than the other ones were. But anyway, the idea is that sort of these things develop, and then we do exactly this. We take pictures. I think we have 10 pictures of this where you can sort of gradually see that it progresses. And there's another one of these, or maybe it was this. No, yeah, but it doesn't matter. There was another one of these same things where you could put in little voting sticks, where at some point suddenly there's a very long green line of green sticks that are in a total line that turns up. And obviously that's a child or possibly an adult, but I think a child that's been sitting there playing with the sticks and putting them in, which of course is kind of a nice thing as well. And I can't actually remember whether we had employed students to sort of be at the desk and look at it. And I think at some point we agreed that they should take some of them out, because the thing is, if you leave that, then of course other people will come and make a similar thing. So it's to try to keep it. But of course this is not a sort of democratic equal vote where people can do whatever they want with these. Right, and as people were leaving, they were asked whether they'd made their mind up and then to vote for one of these ideals. And actually that provoked quite a lot of discussion when there were groups, because they sort of disagreed and, In another installation, we've made people vote when they go in and vote when they go out, and they vote very differently, and although some of them think that they vote the same. I mean, it's just this. It sort of really questions the idea of how people, what they think about when they vote in this. But of course, the whole point is we're not testing cognitive clarity. We're doing something completely different. So basically, all this voting, it's not actually to see what people vote as much as it is a tool to make people think about it, rather than to sort of, see what they think. Yeah, and that's the end of it. And that's just all the names of all the lovely people that were part of creating it. Because obviously I can't do any of this myself. So, yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much.
Scientists at the installation, and what was their perspective?
Yeah, there were actually quite a few, because they came to the site as part of the ESOF, or because there was lots of exhibitions around, right? So it wasn't a tent from the University of Copenhagen. So there were other people there, and then there was the other universities had their tents, so they would come around as well. Very mixed. I mean, we didn't do any systematic taking in, because it would simply have ruined the actual experience of being there. But very mixed. I've had lots of but mostly I'd say curiosity, a need to discuss. Sort of, they want to discuss, why is it like this and not like that, or I think this. For instance, when that group with the vice chancellor was there, there's a physicist who's also a head of department who was there as well, and he after sort of they had voted, he came over to me and said, they voted wrongly, you know, I would have gone for the red one, like the integration one. And afterwards I was thinking, did he say that because he thought that, or was that because he thought, you know, that's what Maja wants me to say, or, you know, there's all these things, so but a lot of sort of interest in engaging or discussing or disagreeing, or, you know, that one is good, but I don't like that one over there. I think, well, if anything, they have a lot more reflections on it. I think scientists in general find it easier to engage with it, because it sort of mirrors some of all the reflections they already have. Whereas I think some citizens who have no other experience of science, they get quite confused about this, because it's like, that's very complicated, you know. Isn't science just about finding the answers? So it's not. This installation isn't really very good for people who have absolutely no experience of science, because it's very complicated, and it actually, because we had a whole layer of Facebook interaction and stuff like that, which you could use the Facebook for as well, but that was simply too much. People couldn't comprehend all these things at the same time, and so once they found out how to use the iPad for scanning the videos and seeing them, they were like, no, don't tell me about the Facebook stuff, I don't want to know, because I can't cope with that as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I would love to visit the installation again, so it's a pity that there anymore. But my question relates to the grounding work of the installation first, the discourse analysis. You have presented those 4 item types, but is there any dynamic in the creation of these frames of the science-society relationships? I could imagine that the frame of demarcation is frame that is predominant in the 70s, and now it is substituted to the integration frame. This would be one question.
Yeah.
And the other 2 relates to the heuristic tool you have developed with this installation. In how far are you dealing with the response that you have acquired from the installation itself? You presented some of the response, because it's a very complex issue for science and society relationship, and you can get new insights into how it is perceived by different actors. And of course, the last question would be, how is the election of the ideals going out? What was the result? Is the public preferring the demarcation or the integration model, for example?
Yeah.
So it would be very interesting, though it is not a technical vote.
Yeah. So the first thing, over time, the problem with this is that the way we sampled doesn't really allow us to say something very clear about time, because the way we could sample using scopers, it means that we get more and more. We have it's the sort of, we have fewer articles. I think we didn't take anything from before 1960 because that was too difficult to get. I mean, that was just too. We didn't really know how much we were getting if we were looking at that. And then it's like we have very few from the beginning, and then it becomes more and more. But what I can say is it's not that it isn't easily distributed over time. So if we look at the last decade in our collection, we find awful, and we can't say that there's more of this. But that's because we have quite a lot from places like Nature and Science and things. We ruled out a lot of papers that was about responsibility, but for instance, if it was a descriptive, so our own paper would be ruled out because it doesn't have a normative stance on what the responsibility of science is. So we only took things that actually say what is the responsibility of science. And we also ruled out stuff that was sort of purely on research ethics. But the best answer I can give you is that we can't see in that collection that there's a change over time. We can't say that one is ruled out. There's still defenders of the demarcation ideal also after the year 2000. What we can say also is that integration is not solely the ideal of social scientists and humanities people who start writing into this, but that's where we can see that quite specifically. But there are also scientists who will argue similar things, so natural scientists. In terms of dealing with the responses, we have tried to do that with the other two installations that we've made, try to more sort of systematically collect responses. And what we found is that in each case, well, first of all, the responses aren't very trustworthy because it's ourselves doing them, and we haven't had resources to have other people trying to engage. And it's kind of, well, that's also on the idea of making installations like that. So if I do a focus group after people have seen this, they will strangely say that they think it's a good idea. and people in general, my experience is with these things, because basically the best response that we have is that people say in general that they become more confused or confused at a higher level. They know more about why it isn't so easy. So they have their sort of their arguments and their viewpoints expanded. And I think that's a valid result. In terms of what they vote, it's interesting because one of the other installations we had, people would come out of that and say that was about stem cell research. And people would come and say, oh, but you're in favor of embryonic stem cell research. And we actually had done our very best to balance it. But it was because one room that dealt with this, that kind of was seen to be in favor, that was just a really great design of that room. So that made much more of an impression than the opposite room that did the opposite. So I don't think that we can use these things as ways of measuring what people think. I think what it is, it's really good at sort of sparking reflection and thinking and debate and discussion. I think if we want to know what people think, we need to use other methods for that, sadly. Although, of course, if we could record all the discussions that take place in there, or if people had actually used the Facebook interaction, if that had happened, then we might have had some more interesting results that we could use from there. I have a list of all the problems that people think and all the comments that they make. And of course, that's some kind of input. And it's the best thing I can say from that is that it's just very varied. And that kind of also goes to the last. I can't say that the public preferred something, or scientists preferred something else. What I can say, which was also, you can slightly see it here in the last image. That if you look down there at the left, you can see there's these black columns, that's magnets, where they vote by putting a magnet on, and you can see there's most on the red ideal, which tended to be the outcome of this. Whether that's because the whole installation in some ways is configured within this ideal, if we want to go meta, and therefore that's why people answer like that, I don't know. But that could be one explanation.
Thank you, Maja, for this. This is fascinating, really. And what caught my interest was that this moment when people were able to mark how many human lives they
Yeah.
are willing to put at risk for the benefit of the majority.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, it's all fine, but those people are not really people. They don't have faces. They don't
No.
have names, and so it's easy to decide when they are, abstract thing really. But when it comes to real situations, I'm quite interested in recently in fascination and anti-fascination things. And there was this documentary filmed in Denmark on fascinated girls, I think it's called.
Yeah.
And it's this on, and it features three characters, three girls suffering from side effects of this
HPV, yeah.
And three of them, yes. And as far as I know, this documentary raised a lot of emotions. So are there any voices saying, well, this is the price we have to pay so that the majority can benefit? I think this is, when it comes to real people with real faces, real names, it's completely different. I'm interested in.
Yeah, I totally agree. And actually, we had a lot of discussions. I mean, I also hinted at, we had a lot of discussions. The idea here is that it's more difficult. The designer insisted that it had to be actual people. It's more difficult to put a ring around the shape of a person than just to write a number, right? And I agree with you, if that had been real people, with real faces, then it would have been more difficult, because suddenly you single out that person to be hit by this. I think that this also speaks to the difference between, epidemiology and predictive forward, and saying, out of a group we save 1 million and 3 people might be at risk, or looking backwards and saying, we might have saved 1 million, but these 3 people, me and Arrow and you, were the ones who suffered. I think there's a huge difference there, and I would like to, I don't necessarily have views on that, although I am, basically my own view on this is that with the HPV vaccine, I think the problem is that the health authorities say there's absolutely no risk. I think that's dumb. But I think that most parents like myself, I chose to have my kids vaccinated for children diseases, because I know about measles, and I know that kids die of that, and that the risk of dying of that is higher than so it's like, but of course, so I believe in a lot of these statistics, right? I know not everybody does, but I think the problem is that we don't talk about it. The problem is when we act as if it's certain. That's why the idea here is simply to make something that allows people to think about it, rather than just to say either, like the scientists, there's no risk, or, there's risk is terrible. But I would love to do this. It would be fun to do something that would make exactly this, the difference between the epidemiological gaze and the actual victims, that would make that sort of visible, how that's not the same thing.
If you could go back to the slide with the model of full responsibility.
Yeah.
Okay, so my understanding is that these 4 models are more like, encouraging scientists to becoming more proactive about their research, so that they want to touch upon, specific problems which are important to be solved at that particular time. But my question is, if you look into integration model, for example, we say societal actors should be included. So first of all, there's not a necessary consensus between these societal actors themselves. Even let's say among scientists, there's no consensus about a particular problem, which can, direct these endeavors into one direction, which which is a problem. And I'm asking you, what is your take on when, let's say, even if scientists become proactive and they know what social problems should be solved, and if they do make their efforts and there's this money pouring in those research, when these efforts, the outcomes, when they're socially rejected based on emotional grounds or cultural or ethical grounds, like what is your take on that?
So first of all, actually what this model demonstrates is that while almost everyone says that science has to be socially responsible, that everyone agrees on that, almost. But the point is that while we can all agree on that, we actually have very different ideas of what this responsibility is. So that's what this model basically says. It's saying, yeah, you might think you agree, but when we look into what you mean with the words that you say, we can see that you disagree violently. So for instance, demarcation says science should not be influenced by undue biases, for instance, by industry. So industry shouldn't have any say over what goes on within science because they have their own special interests and we don't want that to bias science. Whereas the integration says exactly the opposite. We can only make real good, useful, socially robust science that works in society if we include people in the sort of outside stakeholders in the actual process of doing science. So they totally disagree. And actually they also disagree with, the other ones. So that's the point of the model, is not so much to say what scientists should do, but to say, we might have a problem here, even though we think we agree, we actually don't agree. So that's the point. And it's also, in some ways, that's intended to help scientists who think it's very, very difficult to do what everyone else says they should, when they should be responsible. Because it's saying, yes, scientists, you are right, people are saying different things. To the other, which I think is slightly a different question. So what happens, what should scientists do when they do their best and then they do something that they think is a help to society, and then they find that people disagree with it? Well, so that's one of the main things that I do when I work with a synthetic biologist, is to try to make them more brave. Well, they are brave, but to try to help them actually come out and have a discussion earlier rather than later. Because I think that having this discussion it might not work, but it's the best way we have in order to try to make socially robust knowledge. So in order to try to do something that won't be rejected by people outside, I think it's important that scientists actually, and other people, actually engage in a discussion about this. Because when you have science has done one thing, science does not want, groups in society does not want that. There's basically two different ways of solving this problem. Either you can do a different science, or you can change, what people think. And I think we need to do both. So some of the stuff that, for instance, I've been having long discussions with the synthetic biologist about whether they want to use CRISPR, and they don't. And that's not because of me, but we've been discussing why it is they don't want to take that into their practice. And that's because they think that will give them lots of problems later on, even though it might be a fine technique, but they also think it's oversold. So there's lots more there. But that's the kind of way. I don't have the solution, because, we don't, but it's better to try to work with this and face it up front rather than to hide it and think that it'll go away, because I don't think it'll go away.
So my follow-up question would be, as a social scientist, how we can assess these, case studies, for example, of social rejection, because like you said, if we have discussions, it can also have some, local factors which drive that research. But however, once it comes to the market, because of globalization, it spreads everywhere. However, one product can be popular in, let's say, Europe, but would
I think that we have to learn to be specific. We can't talk about GM crops as if it's one thing. I think GM crops is a totally different object in Europe and in Asia and in the US, and I think we have to study that specifically. So it just means that there's lots of work to do, because we can't just transport one idea into where someone else. But I think for Europe, in terms of the European public being relatively skeptic towards GM crops, I actually see some signs that some of that is changing. But I think that we certainly have to think that, so we can do with the science that's done, for instance, in Denmark, we can do the best thing we can in order to try to take in different accounts. But of course, it's done in Denmark. It has to be configured and worked out in that cultural setting, which is not necessarily working in a different one. But then, so it's kind of start where you are and then see how far that gets you, and then learn how you have to change when you adopt further out.
I have a quick question about thinking about responsibility in science and how science is think through these issues. And you were talking about ideals and so forth. And it occurred to me that in my work, when I follow scientists in the lab, it is incredibly mind-numbing. It's the most boring, tedious, automated thing. I've looked at a person do this all day long, and then they say, yeah, and tomorrow I'm going to be doing this all day long, and the next day, and the next day. And I try to sort of think through that, where's the excitement of the risk, the caution, and what about all these principles? And they say, okay. And it's an interesting sort of dynamic in the lab. Yeah, they're able to talk about all these things and relate to them, but also I have a tremendous amount of sympathy for them when, me as a social scientist comes in and says, or somebody comes in and says, where's the engagement with the public? Why aren't you bringing this out? What are you doing in the lab? And they're just like, what's the next step? We put this in the fridge and 37 degrees, and I'll press this. And how do you manage or think through that in terms of, or communicate, if you will, the mundane side of doing it?
And the problem is the next day they'll think, did I do that right? Did I make a mistake? Oh shit, I've got to do it all again now because I'm unsure that I did it right. And that actually speaks to, because Cecilie, whose name is down there at the bottom, she was doing that project B, so she was doing lab ethnographies and exactly following this. And one of the first things that happened when she was doing a pilot study was that she was sort of being asked about what she was doing, and she explained the project. And they just looked at her and said, I assure you, there's nothing responsible that goes on here. And it's just, and what they meant was just, you're not going to see that, which is true. And she had to totally change the way she presented the project, so that she didn't talk about, your responsibility as a scientist, but she talked about sort of to see the practices and the calls for engaging with further society, and then scientists, because they had heard something about this third mission, maybe, as a kind of push for commercialization or something. So then they gave them some idea of what it was she was doing. And it wasn't that she was hiding the responsibility word. It was just that was absolutely not useful for her to engage. So that came later. And that was exactly she did that. Then Sarah and I did a lot of interviews with managers. And from both sides, we had this totally strong sense that all that policy stuff about responsible research and innovation, absolutely not relevant. As in, we just don't, it's not what we do. Okay, but what do you feel responsible? What do you feel responsible for? Oh man, for bringing up the scientists, the junior scientists, so that they learn to do good science, the students, to take care of them, that they learn good practices. Well, some of them have issues of health and safety in the labs, all of that stuff, of course, for bringing in money. That's the major responsibility of the managers, is to keep the group going. So Sarah and I have written another paper which is called Crafting the Group, which is actually the outcome of that, because what was so clear was that the research managers, their biggest perceived responsibility is this keeping the group going. And it has a lot to do with sort of family imaginations of bringing up the young ones, or they see the group managers as the breadwinner, and that kind of responsibility is very, very strong. And then, of course, all this policy, the RRI policy stuff can come in as something that we need to take in as well, or possibly even for some an opportunity to generate funding. But it's like, so that was for them the strongest response. I mean, that's just the one that comes up all the time. With the bench scientists, I mean, Cecilia has 3, and some of that I've already, but the first one she talks about is this thing of getting the science right, the counting right. Exactly. That's why when you start thinking, did I count that right? They have to do it all over again, because they're all scared of being the one that does a mistake that will then not only harm them, but harm their group. That's their responsibility to the group. Harm the group, but also harm science. So that's the strongest responsibility they have. And in that sense, you know, if you can link, so what we would like to argue now is if you can link RRI into those kinds of concerns, then you can easily have a discussion with scientists about that, because they do feel responsible for science and also for science doing good in society. So there are links. It's just that you have to translate. You can't just go and say, Arrow, what does the RI make you do differently than what you do the other day? Because that's not how it works. Yeah?
Any other questions or comments? Thank you very much, Maja.
Well, thank you.